Don't forget to subscribe. Afterwards, the wisest and most spiritual books from the greatest authors await you every day. And now buckle up, sit back and we'll begin. Carlos Castaneda. Book 2. Task of Seeing. Don Juan asked me abruptly if I was planning to leave for home during the weekend. I said I intended to leave Monday morning. We were sitting under his ramada around midday on Saturday, January 18, 1969, taking a rest after a long walk in the nearby hills. Don Juan got up and went into the house. A few moments later he called me inside. He was sitting in the middle of his room and had placed my straw mat in front of his. He motioned me to sit down, and without saying a word he unwrapped his pipe, took it out of its sheath, filled its bowl with his smoking mixture, and lit it. He had even brought into his room a clay tray filled with small charcoals. He did not ask me whether I was willing to smoke. He just handed me the pipe and told me to puff. I did not hesitate. Don Juan had apparently assessed my mood correctly. My overwhelming curiosity about the guardian must have been obvious to him. I did not need any coaxing and eagerly smoked the entire bowl. The reactions I had were identical to those I had had before. Don Juan also proceeded in very much the same manner. This time, however, instead of helping me to do it, he just told me to prop my right arm on the mat and lie down on my left side. He suggested that I should make a fist if that would give me a better leverage. I did make a fist with my right hand because I found it was easier than turning my palm against the floor. While lying with my weight on it, I was not sleepy. I felt very warm for a while, then I lost all feeling. Don Juan lay down on his side facing me. His right forearm rested on his elbow and propped his head up like a pillow. Everything was perfectly placid, even my body, which by then lacked tactile sensations. I felt very content. "It's nice," I said. Don Juan got up hurriedly. "Don't you dare start with this crap," he said forcefully. "Don't talk. You'll waste every bit of energy talking, and then the guardian will mash you down, like you would smash a gnat." He must have thought that his simile was funny because he began to laugh, but he stopped suddenly. "Don't talk, please don't talk," he said with a serious look on his face. "I wasn't about to say anything," I said, "and I really did not want to say that." Don Juan got up. I saw him walking away toward the back of his house. A moment later I noticed that a gnat had landed on my mat, and that filled me with a kind of anxiety I had never experienced before. It was a mixture of elation, anguish, and fear. I was totally aware that something transcendental was about to unfold in front of me, a gnat who guarded the other world. It was a ludicrous thought. I felt like laughing out loud, but then I realized that my elation was distracting me, and I was going to miss a transition period I wanted to clarify. In my previous attempt to see the guardian, I had looked at the gnat first with my left eye, and then I felt that I had stood up and looked at it with both eyes, but I was not aware how that transition had occurred. I saw the gnat whirling around on the mat in front of my face and realized that I was looking at it with both eyes. It came very close. At a given moment I could not see it with both eyes any longer and shifted the view to my left eye, which was level with the ground. The instant I changed focus, I also felt that I had straightened my body to a fully vertical position, and I was looking at an unbelievably enormous animal. It was brilliantly black. Its front was covered with long, black, insidious hair, which looked like spikes coming through the cracks of some slick, shiny scales. The hair was actually arranged in tufts. Its body was massive, thick and round. Its wings were wide and short in comparison to the length of its body. It had two white, bulging eyes and a long muzzle. This time it looked more like an alligator. It seemed to have long ears, or perhaps horns, and it was drooling. I strained myself to fix my gaze on it, and then became fully aware that I could not look at it in the same way I ordinarily look at things. I had a strange thought. Looking at the guardian's body, I felt that every single part of it was independently alive, as the eyes of men are alive. I realized then for the first time in my life that the eyes were the only part of a man that could show, to me, whether or not he was alive. The guardian, on the other hand, had a million eyes. I thought this was a remarkable finding. Before this experience I had speculated on the similes that could describe the distortions that rendered an ant as a gigantic beast, and I had thought that a good simile was as if looking at an insect through the magnifying lens of a microscope. But that was not so. Apparently viewing the guardian was much more complex than looking at a magnified insect. The guardian began to whirl in front of me. At one moment it stopped and I felt it was looking at me. I noticed then that it made no sound. The dance of the guardian was silent. The awesomeness was in its appearance. Its bulging eyes, its horrendous mouth, its drooling, its insidious hair, and above all its incredible size. I watched very closely the way it moved its wings, how it made them vibrate without sound. I watched how it skidded over the ground like a monumental ice skater. Looking at that nightmarish creature in front of me, I actually felt elated. I really believed I had discovered the secret of overpowering it. I thought the guardian was only a moving picture on a silent screen. It could not harm me, it only looked terrifying. The guardian was standing still, facing me. Suddenly it fluttered its wings and turned around. Its back looked like brilliantly colored armor, its shine was dazzling, but the hue was nauseating. It was my unfavorable color. The guardian remained with its back turned to me for a while, and then, fluttering its wings, again skidded out of sight. I was confronted with a very strange dilemma. I honestly believed that I had overpowered it by realizing that it presented only a picture of wrath. My belief was perhaps due to Don Juan's insistence that I knew more than I was willing to admit. At any rate, I felt I had overcome the guardian and the path was free. Yet I did not know how to proceed. Don Juan had not told me what to do in such a case. I tried to turn and look behind me, but I was unable to move. However, I could see very well over the major part of a 180-degree range in front of my eyes. And what I saw was a cloudy, pale yellow horizon. It seemed gaseous. A sort of lemon hue uniformly covered all I could see. It seemed that I was on a plateau filled with vapors of sulfur. Suddenly the guardian appeared again at a point on the horizon. It made a wide circle before stopping in front of me. Its mouth was wide open, like a huge cavern. It had no teeth. It vibrated its wings for an instant, and then it charged at me. It actually charged at me like a bull, and with its gigantic wings it swung at my eyes. I screamed with pain and then I flew up, or rather I felt I had ejected myself up, and went soaring beyond the guardian, beyond the yellowish plateau, into another world, the world of men, and I found myself standing in the middle of Don Juan's room. January 19, 1969. I really thought I had overpowered the Guardian, I said to Don Juan. You must be kidding, he said. Don Juan had not spoken one word to me since the day before, and I did not mind it. I had been immersed in a sort of reverie, and again I had felt that if I looked intently, I would be able to see. But I did not see anything that was different. Not talking, however, had relaxed me tremendously. Don Juan asked me to recount the sequence of my experience, and what particularly interested him was the hue I had seen on the Guardian's back. Don Juan sighed and seemed to be really concerned. You were lucky that the color was on the Guardian's back, he said with a serious face. Had it been on the front part of its body, or worse yet, on its head, you would be dead by now. You must not try to see the Guardian ever again. It's not your temperament to cross that plane, yet I was convinced that you could go through it. But let's not talk about it anymore. This was only one of a variety of roads. I detected an unaccustomed heaviness in Don Juan's tone. What will happen to me if I try to see the Guardian again? The Guardian will take you away, he said. It will pick you up in its mouth and carry you into that plane and leave you there forever. It is obvious that the Guardian knew that it is not your temperament and warned you to stay away. How do you think the Guardian knew that? Don Juan gave me a long, steadfast look. He tried to say something, but gave up as though he was unable to find the right words. I always fall for your questions, he said, smiling. You were not really thinking when you asked me that, were you? I protested and reaffirmed that it puzzled me that the Guardian knew my temperament. Don Juan had a strange glint in his eye when he said, and you had not even mentioned anything about your temperament to the Guardian, had you? His tone was so comically serious that we both laughed. After a while, however, he said that the Guardian, being the keeper, the watchman of that world, knew many secrets that a Brujo was entitled to share. That's one way a Brujo gets to see, he said. But that will not be your domain, so there is no point in talking about it. Is smoking the only way to see the Guardian? I asked. No. You could also see it without it. There are scores of people who could do that. I prefer the smoke because it is more effective and less dangerous to oneself. If you try to see the Guardian without the aid of the smoke, chances are that you may delay in getting out of its way. In your case, for instance, it is obvious that the Guardian was warning you when it turned its back, so you would look at your enemy color. Then it went away, but when it came back you were still there, so it charged at you. You were prepared, however, and jumped. The little smoke gave you the protection you needed. Had you gone into that world without its aid, you wouldn't have been able to extricate yourself from the Guardian's grip. Why not? Your movements would have been too slow. To survive in that world you need to be as fast as lightning. It was my mistake to leave the room, but I didn't want you to talk anymore. You are a blabbermouth, so you talk even against your desire. Had I been there with you I would have pulled your head up. You jumped up by yourself, which was even better. However, I would rather not run a risk like that. The Guardian is not something you can fool around with. For 3 months Don Juan systematically avoided talking about the Guardian. I paid him 4 visits during these months. He involved me in running errands for him every time, and when I had performed the errands he simply told me to go home. On April 24, 1969, the 4th time I was at his house, I finally confronted him after we had eaten dinner and were sitting next to his earthen stove. I told him that he was doing something incongruous to me. I was ready to learn, and yet he did not even want me around. I had had to struggle very hard to overcome my aversion to using his hallucinogenic mushrooms, and I felt, as he had said himself, that I had no time to lose. Don Juan patiently listened to my complaints. "You're too weak," he said. "You hurry when you should wait, but you wait when you should hurry. You think too much. Now you think that there is no time to waste. A while back you thought you didn't want to smoke anymore. Your life is too damn loose. You're not tight enough to meet the little smoke. I am responsible for you and I don't want you to die like a goddamn fool." I felt embarrassed. "What can I do, Don Juan? I'm very impatient. Live like a warrior. I've told you already, a warrior takes responsibility for his acts, for the most trivial of his acts. You act out your thoughts and that's wrong. You failed with the Guardian because of your thoughts." "How did I fail, Don Juan?" "You think about everything. You thought about the Guardian and thus you couldn't overcome it. First you must live like a warrior. I think you understand that very well." I wanted to interject something in my defense, but he gestured with his hand to be quiet. "Your life is fairly tight," he continued. "In fact, your life is tighter than Pablito's or Nestor's, Gennaro's apprentices, and yet they see and you don't. Your life is tighter than Eligio's, and he'll probably see before you do. This baffles me. Even Gennaro cannot get over that. You've faithfully carried out everything I have told you to do. Everything that my benefactor taught me in the first stage of learning, I have passed on to you. The rule is right, the steps cannot be changed. You have done everything one has to do and yet you don't see, but to those who see, like Gennaro, you appear as though you see. I rely on that and I am fooled. You always turn around and behave like an idiot who doesn't see, which of course is right for you." Don Juan's words distressed me profoundly. I don't know why, but I was close to tears. I began to talk about my childhood, and a wave of self-pity enveloped me. Don Juan stared at me for a brief moment, and then moved his eyes away. It was a penetrating glance. I felt he had actually grabbed me with his eyes. I had the sensation of two fingers gently clasping me, and I acknowledged a weird agitation, an itching, a pleasant despair in the area of my solar plexus. I became aware of my abdominal region. I sensed its heat. I could not speak coherently anymore and I mumbled, then stopped talking altogether. "Perhaps it's the promise," Don Juan said after a long pause. "I beg your pardon. A promise you once made, long ago." "What promise? Maybe you can tell me that. You do remember it, don't you?" "I don't." "You promised something very important once. I thought that perhaps your promise was keeping you from seeing." "I don't know what you're talking about." "I'm talking about a promise you made. You must remember it. If you know what the promise was, why don't you tell me, Don Juan?" "No. It won't do any good to tell you." "Was it a promise I made to myself?" For a moment I thought he might be referring to my resolution to quit the apprenticeship. "No. This is something that took place a long time ago," he said. I laughed because I was certain Don Juan was playing some sort of game with me. I felt mischievous. I had a sensation of elation at the idea that I could fool Don Juan, who, I was convinced, knew as little as I did about the alleged promise. I was sure he was fishing in the dark and trying to improvise. The idea of humoring him delighted me. Was it something I promised to my grandpa? No, he said, and his eyes glittered. Neither was it something you promised to your little grandma. The ludicrous intonation he gave to the word grandma made me laugh. I thought Don Juan was setting some sort of trap for me, but I was willing to play the game to the end. I began enumerating all the possible individuals to whom I could have promised something of great importance. He said no to each. Then he steered the conversation to my childhood. Why was your childhood sad? He asked with a serious expression. I told him that my childhood had not really been sad, but perhaps a bit difficult. Everybody feels that way, he said, looking at me again. I too was very unhappy and afraid when I was a child. To be an Indian is hard, very hard. But the memory of that time no longer has meaning for me. Beyond that, it was hard. I had ceased to think about the hardship of my life even before I had learned to see. I don't think about my childhood either, I said. Why does it make you sad, then? Why do you want to weep? I don't know. Perhaps when I think of myself as a child, I feel sorry for myself and for all my fellow men. I feel helpless and sad. He looked at me fixedly, and again my abdominal region registered the weird sensation of two gentle fingers clasping it. I moved my eyes away and then glanced back at him. He was looking into the distance, past me. His eyes were foggy, out of focus. It was a promise of your childhood, he said after a moment's silence. What did I promise? He did not answer. His eyes were closed. I smiled involuntarily. I knew he was feeling his way in the dark. However, I had lost some of my original impetus to humor him. I was a skinny child, he went on, and I was always afraid. So was I said. What I remember the most is the terror and sadness that fell upon me when the Mexican soldiers killed my mother, he said softly, as if the memory was still painful. She was a poor and humble Indian. Perhaps it was better that her life was over then. I wanted to be killed with her, because I was a child. But the soldiers picked me up and beat me. When I grabbed onto my mother's body, they hit my fingers with a horsewhip and broke them. I didn't feel any pain, but I couldn't grasp any more, and then they dragged me away. He stopped talking. His eyes were still closed, and I could detect a very slight tremor in his lips. A profound sadness began to overtake me. Images of my own childhood started to flood my mind. How old were you, Don Juan? I asked, just to offset the sadness in me. Maybe 7. That was the time of the Great Yaqui Wars. The Mexican soldiers came upon us unexpectedly while my mother was cooking some food. She was a helpless woman. They killed her for no reason at all. It doesn't make any difference that she died that way, not really, and yet for me it does. I cannot tell myself why, though, it just does. I thought they had killed my father too, but they hadn't. He was wounded. Later on they put us in a tram like cattle and closed the door. For days they kept us there in the dark, like animals. They kept us alive with bits of food they threw into the wagon from time to time. My father died of his wounds in that wagon. He became delirious with pain and fever, and went on telling me that I had to survive. He kept on telling me that until the very last moment of his life. The people took care of me. They gave me food. An old woman curer fixed the broken bones of my hand. And as you can see, I lived. Life has been neither good nor bad to me. Life has been hard. Life is hard, and for a child it is sometimes horror itself. We did not speak for a very long time. Perhaps an hour went by in complete silence. I had very confusing feelings. I was somewhat dejected, and yet I could not tell why. I experienced a sense of remorse. A while before I had been willing to humor Don Juan, but he had suddenly turned the tables with his direct account. It had been simple and concise and had produced a strange feeling in me. The idea of a child undergoing pain had always been a touchy subject for me. In an instant my feelings of empathy for Don Juan gave way to a sensation of disgust with myself. I had actually taken notes, as if Don Juan's life were merely a clinical case. I was on the verge of ripping up my notes when Don Juan poked my calf with his toe to attract my attention. He said he was seeing a light of violence around me and wondered whether I was going to start beating him. His laughter was a delightful break. He said that I was given to outbursts of violent behavior, but that I was not really mean, and that most of the time the violence was against myself. "You're right, Don Juan," I said. "Of course," he said, laughing. He urged me to talk about my childhood. I began to tell him about my years of fear and loneliness, and got involved in describing to him what I thought to be my overwhelming struggle to survive and maintain my spirit. He laughed at the metaphor of maintaining my spirit. I talked for a long time. He listened with a serious expression. Then, at a given moment, his eyes clasped me again and I stopped talking. After a moment's pause, he said that nobody had ever humiliated me, and that was the reason I was not really mean. "You haven't been defeated yet," he said. He repeated the statement 4 or 5 times, so I felt obliged to ask him what he meant by that. He explained that to be defeated was a condition of life which was unavoidable. Men were either victorious or defeated, and, depending on that, they became persecutors or victims. These two conditions were prevalent as long as one did not see. Seeing dispelled the illusion of victory, or defeat, or suffering. He added that I should learn to see while I was victorious to avoid ever having the memory of being humiliated. I protested that I was not and had never been victorious at anything, and that my life was, if anything, a defeat. He laughed and threw his hat on the floor. "If your life is such a defeat, step on my hat," he dared me in jest. I sincerely argued my point. Don Juan became serious. His eyes squinted to a fine slit. He said that I thought my life was a defeat for reasons other than defeat itself. Then, in a very quick and thoroughly unexpected manner, he took my head in his hands by placing his palms against my temples. His eyes became fierce as he looked into mine. Out of fright, I took an involuntary deep breath through my mouth. He let my head go and reclined against a wall, still gazing at me. He had performed his movements with such a speed that by the time he had relaxed and reclined comfortably against a wall, I was still in the middle of my deep breath. I felt dizzy, ill at ease. "I see a little boy crying," Don Juan said after a pause. He repeated it various times as if I did not understand. I had the feeling he was talking about me as a little boy crying, so I did not really pay attention to it. "Hey," he said, demanding my full concentration. "I see a little boy crying." I asked him if that boy was me. He said no. Then I asked him if it was a vision of my life or just a memory of his own life. He did not answer. "I see a little boy," he continued saying. "And he is crying and crying. Is he a boy I know? I asked. Yes. Is he my little boy? No. Is he crying now? He's crying now, he said with conviction. I thought Don Juan was having a vision of someone I knew who was a little boy and who was at that very moment crying. I voiced the names of all the children I knew, but he said those children were irrelevant to my promise, and the child who was crying was very important to it. Don Juan's statements seemed to be incongruous. He had said that I had promised something to someone during my childhood, and that the child who was crying at that very moment was important to my promise. I told him he was not making sense. He calmly repeated that he saw a little boy crying at that moment, and that the little boy was hurt. I seriously struggled to fit his statements into some sort of orderly pattern, but I could not relate them to anything I was aware of. I give up, I said, because I can't remember making an important promise to anybody, least of all to a child. He squinted his eyes again and said that this particular child who was crying at that precise moment was a child of my childhood. He was a child during my childhood and is still crying now? I asked. He is a child crying now, he insisted. Do you realize what you're saying, Don Juan? I do. It doesn't make sense. How can he be a child now if he was one when I was a child myself? He's a child and he's crying now, he said stubbornly. Explain it to me, Don Juan. No. You must explain it to me. For the life of me I could not fathom what he was referring to. He's crying. He's crying. Don Juan kept on saying in a mesmerizing tone. And he's hugging you now. He's hurt. He's hurt. And he's looking at you. Do you feel his eyes? He's kneeling and hugging you. He's younger than you. He has come running to you. But his arm is broken. Do you feel his arm? That little boy has a nose that looks like a button. Yes. That's a button nose. My ears began to buzz, and I lost the sensation of being at Don Juan's house. The words button nose plunged me at once into a scene out of my childhood. I knew a button nose boy. Don Juan had edged his way into one of the most recondite places of my life. I knew then the promise he was talking about. I had a sensation of elation, of despair, of awe for Don Juan and his splendid maneuver. How in the devil did he know about the button-nosed boy of my childhood? I became so agitated by the memory Don Juan had evoked in me that my power to remember took me back to a time when I was 8 years old. My mother had left 2 years before and I had spent the most hellish years of my life circulating among my mother's sisters, who served as dutiful mother surrogates and took care of me a couple of months at a time. Each of my aunts had a large family, and no matter how careful and protective the aunts were toward me, I had 22 cousins to contend with. Their cruelty was sometimes truly bizarre. I felt then that I was surrounded by enemies, and in the excruciating years that followed, I waged a desperate and sordid war. Finally, through means I still do not know to this day, I succeeded in subduing all my cousins. I was indeed victorious. I had no more competitors who counted. However, I did not know that, nor did I know how to stop my war, which logically was extended to the school grounds. The classrooms of the rural school where I went were mixed, and the first and third grades were separated only by a space between the desks. It was there that I met a little boy with a flat nose, who was teased with the nickname Button Nose. He was a first grader. I used to pick on him haphazardly, not really intending to. But he seemed to like me in spite of everything I did to him. He used to follow me around and even kept a secret that I was responsible for some of the pranks that baffled the principal. And yet I still teased him. One day I deliberately toppled over a heavy standing blackboard. It fell on him. The desk in which he was sitting absorbed some of the impact, but still the blow broke his collarbone. He fell down. I helped him up and saw the pain and fright in his eyes as he looked at me and held onto me. The shock of seeing him in pain, with a mangled arm, was more than I could bear. For years I had viciously battled against my cousins and I had won. I had vanquished my foes. I had felt good and powerful up to the moment when the sight of the button-nosed little boy crying demolished my victories. Right there I quit the battle. In whatever way I was capable of, I made a resolution not to win ever again. I thought his arm would have to be cut off, and I promised that if the little boy was cured, I would never again be victorious. I gave up my victories for him. That was the way I understood it then. Don Juan had opened a festered sore in my life. I felt dizzy, overwhelmed. A well of unmitigated sadness beckoned me and I succumbed to it. I felt the weight of my acts on me. The memory of that little button-nosed boy, whose name was Joaquin, produced in me such a vivid anguish that I wept. I told Don Juan of my sadness for that boy who never had anything, that little Joaquin who did not have money to go to a doctor, and whose arm never set properly. And all I had to give him were my childish victories. I felt so ashamed. "Be in peace, you funny bird," Don Juan said imperatively. "You gave enough. Your victories were strong and they were yours. You gave enough. Now you must change your promise." "How do I change it? Do I just say so?" "A promise like that cannot be changed by just saying so. Perhaps very soon you'll be able to know what to do about changing it. Then perhaps you'll even get to see. Can you give me any suggestions, Don Juan?" "You must wait patiently, knowing that you're waiting, and knowing what you're waiting for. That is the warrior's way. And if it is a matter of fulfilling your promise, then you must be aware that you are fulfilling it. Then a time will come when your waiting will be over, and you will no longer have to honor your promise. There is nothing you can do for that little boy's life. Only he could cancel that act. But how can't he? By learning to reduce his wants to nothing. As long as he thinks that he was a victim, his life will be hell. And as long as you think the same, your promise will be valid. What makes us unhappy is to want. Yet if we would learn to cut our wants to nothing, the smallest thing we'd get would be a true gift. Be in peace, you made a good gift to Joaquin. To be poor or wanting is only a thought, and so is to hate, or to be hungry, or to be in pain. I cannot truly believe that, Don Juan. How could hunger and pain be only thoughts? They are only thoughts for me now. That's all I know. I have accomplished that feat. The power to do that is all we have, mind you, to oppose the forces of our lives. Without that power we are dregs, dust in the wind. I have no doubt that you have done it, Don Juan, but how can a simple man like myself or little Joaquin accomplish that? It is up to us as single individuals to oppose the forces of our lives. I have said this to you countless times. Only a warrior can survive. The warrior knows that he is waiting and what he is waiting for. And while he waits he wants nothing, and thus whatever little thing he gets is more than he can take. If he needs to eat he finds a way, because he is not hungry, If something hurts his body, he finds a way to stop it because he is not in pain. To be hungry or to be in pain means that the man has abandoned himself and is no longer a warrior, and the forces of his hunger and pain will destroy him. I wanted to go on arguing my point, but I stopped because I realized that by arguing I was making a barrier to protect myself from the devastating force of Don Juan's superb feet, which had touched me so deeply and with such a power. How did he know? I thought that perhaps I had told him the story of the button-nosed boy during one of my deep states of non-ordinary reality. I did not recollect telling him, but my not remembering under such conditions was understandable. How did you know about my promise, Don Juan? I saw it. Did you see it when I had taken mescalito, or when I had smoked your mixture? I saw it now. Today. Did you see the whole thing? There you go again. I've told you, there's no point in talking about what seeing is like. It is nothing. I did not pursue the point any longer. Emotionally, I was convinced. I also made a vow once, Don Juan said suddenly. The sound of his voice made me jump. I promised my father that I would live to destroy his assassins. I carried that promise with me for years. Now the promise is changed. I'm no longer interested in destroying anybody. I don't hate the Mexicans. I don't hate anyone. I have learned that the countless paths one traverses in one's life are all equal. Oppressors and oppressed meet at the end, and the only thing that prevails is that life was altogether too short for both. Today I feel sad not because my mother and father died the way they did. I feel sad because they were Indians. They lived like Indians and died like Indians, and never knew that they were, before anything else, men. I went back to visit Don Juan on May 30, 1969, and bluntly told him that I wanted to take another crack at seeing. He shook his head negatively and laughed, and I felt compelled to protest. He told me I had to be patient and the time was not right, but I doggedly insisted I was ready. He did not seem annoyed with my nagging requests. He tried, nevertheless, to change the subject. I did not let go and asked him to advise me what to do in order to overcome my impatience. You must act like a warrior, he said. How? One learns to act like a warrior by acting, not by talking. You said that a warrior thinks about his death. I do that all the time, obviously that isn't enough. He seemed to have an outburst of impatience and made a smacking sound with his lips. I told him that I had not meant to make him angry, and that if he did not need me there at his house, I was ready to go back to Los Angeles. Don Juan patted me gently on the back and said that he never got angry with me. He had simply assumed I knew what it meant to be a warrior. What can I do to live like a warrior? I asked. He took off his hat and scratched his temples. He looked at me fixedly and smiled. You like everything spelled out, don't you? My mind works that way. It doesn't have to. I don't know how to change. That is why I ask you to tell me exactly what to do to live like a warrior. If I knew that, I could find a way to adapt myself to it. He must have thought my statements were humorous. He patted me on the back as he laughed. I had the feeling he was going to ask me to leave any minute, so I quickly sat down on my straw mat facing him and began asking him more questions. I wanted to know why I had to wait. He explained that if I were to try to see in a helter-skelter manner, before I had healed the wounds I received battling the Guardian, Chances were that I would encounter the guardian again, even though I was not looking for it. Don Juan assured me that no man in that position would be capable of surviving such an encounter. You must completely forget the guardian before you can again embark on the quest of seeing, he said. How can anyone forget the guardian? A warrior has to use his will and his patience to forget. In fact, a warrior has only his will and his patience, and with them he builds anything he wants. But I'm not a warrior. You have started learning the ways of sorcerers. You have no more time for retreats or for regrets. You only have time to live like a warrior and work for patience and will, whether you like it or not. How does a warrior work for them? Don Juan thought for a long time before answering. I think there is no way of talking about it, he finally said. Especially about will. Will is something very special. It happens mysteriously. There is no real way of telling how one uses it, except that the results of using the will are astounding. Perhaps the first thing that one should do is to know that one can develop the will. A warrior knows that and proceeds to wait for it. Your mistake is not to know that you are waiting for your will. My benefactor told me that a warrior knows that he is waiting and knows what he is waiting for. In your case, you know that you're waiting. You've been here with me for years, yet you don't know what you are waiting for. It is very difficult, if not impossible, for the average man to know what he is waiting for. A warrior, however, has no problems. He knows that he is waiting for his will. What exactly is the will? Is it determination, like the determination of your grandson Lucio to have a motorcycle? No, Don Juan said softly and giggled. That's not will. Lucio only indulges. Will is something else, something very clear and powerful which can direct our acts. Will is something a man uses, for instance, to win a battle which he, by all calculations, should lose. Then will must be what we call courage, I said. No. Courage is something else. Men of courage are dependable men, noble men perennially surrounded by people who flock around them and admire them, yet very few men of courage have will. Usually they are fearless men who are given to performing daring common sense acts. Most of the time a courageous man is also fearsome and feared. Will, on the other hand, has to do with astonishing feats that defy our common sense. Is will the control we may have over ourselves? I asked. You may say that it is a kind of control. Do you think I can exercise my will, for instance, by denying myself certain things? Such as asking questions? He interjected. He said it in such a mischievous tone that I had to stop writing to look at him. We both laughed. No, he said. Denying yourself is an indulgence, and I don't recommend anything of the kind. That is the reason why I let you ask all the questions you want. If I told you to stop asking questions, you might warp your will trying to do that. The indulgence of denying is by far the worst. It forces us to believe we are doing great things, when in effect we are only fixed within ourselves. To stop asking questions is not the will I'm talking about. Will is a power. And since it is a power, it has to be controlled and tuned, and that takes time. I know that, and I'm patient with you. When I was your age I was as impulsive as you. Yet I have changed. Our will operates in spite of our indulgence. For example, your will is already opening your gap, little by little. What gap are you talking about? There is a gap in us, like the soft spot on the head of a child which closes with age. This gap opens as one develops one's will. Where is that gap? At the place of your luminous fibers, he said, pointing to his abdominal area. What is it like? What is it for? It's an opening. It allows a space for the will to shoot out, like an arrow. Is the will an object? Or like an object? No. I just said that to make you understand. What a sorcerer calls will is a power within ourselves. It is not a thought or an object or a wish. To stop asking questions is not will because it needs thinking and wishing. Will is what can make you succeed when your thoughts tell you that you're defeated. Will is what makes you invulnerable. Will is what sends a sorcerer through a wall, through space, to the moon, if he wants. There was nothing else I wanted to ask. I was tired and somewhat tense. I was afraid Don Juan was going to ask me to leave, and that annoyed me. Let's go to the hills, he said abruptly, and stood up. On the way he started talking about will again and laughed at my dismay over not being able to take notes. He described will as a force which was the true link between men and the world. He was very careful to establish that the world was whatever we perceive, in any manner we may choose to perceive. Don Juan maintained that perceiving the world entails a process of apprehending whatever presents itself to us. This particular perceiving is done with our senses and with our will. I asked him if will was a sixth sense. He said it was rather a relation between ourselves and the perceived world. I suggested that we halt so I could take notes. He laughed and kept on walking. He did not make me leave that night, and the next day after eating breakfast he himself brought up the subject of will. What you yourself call will is character and strong disposition, he said. What a sorcerer calls will is a force that comes from within and attaches itself to the world out there. It comes out through the belly, right here, where the luminous fibers are. He rubbed his navel to point out the area. I say that it comes out through here because one can feel it coming out. Why do you call it will? I don't call it anything. My benefactor called it will, and other men of knowledge call it will. Yesterday you said that one can perceive the world with the senses as well as with the will. How is that possible? An average man can grab the things of the world only with his hands, or his eyes, or his ears, but a sorcerer can grab them also with his nose, or his tongue, or his will, especially with his will. I cannot really describe how it is done, but you yourself, for instance, cannot describe to me how you hear. It happens that I am also capable of hearing, so we can talk about what we hear, but not about how we hear. A sorcerer uses his will to perceive the world. That perceiving, however, is not like hearing. When we look at the world or when we hear it, we have the impression that it is out there and that it is real. When we perceive the world with our will, we know that it is not as out there or as real as we think. Is will the same as seeing? No. Will is a force, a power. Seeing is not a force, but rather a way of getting through things. A sorcerer may have a very strong will, and yet he may not see, which means that only a man of knowledge perceives the world with his senses and with his will, and also with his seeing. I told him that I was more confused than ever about how to use my will to forget the guardian. That statement and my mood of perplexity seemed to delight him. I've told you that when you talk you only get confused, he said and laughed. But at least now you know you are waiting for your will. You still don't know what it is, or how it could happen to you. So watch carefully everything you do. The very thing that could help you develop your will is amidst all the little things you do. Don Juan was gone all morning. He returned in the early afternoon with a bundle of dry plants. He signaled me with his head to help him, and we worked in complete silence for hours, sorting the plants. When we finished, we sat down to rest and he smiled at me benevolently. I said to him in a very serious manner that I had been reading my notes, and I still could not understand what being a warrior entailed or what the idea of will meant. "Will is not an idea," he said. This was the first time he had spoken to me the whole day. After a long pause he continued, "We are different, you and I. Our characters are not alike. Your nature is more violent than mine. When I was your age I was not violent but mean. You are the opposite. My benefactor was like that. He would have been perfectly suited to be your teacher. He was a great sorcerer, but he did not see, not the way I see or the way Genero sees. I understand the world and live guided by my seeing. My benefactor, on the other hand, had to live as a warrior. If a man sees, he doesn't have to live like a warrior, or like anything else, for he can see things as they really are and direct his life accordingly. But, considering your character, I would say that you may never learn to see, in which case you will have to live your entire life like a warrior." My benefactor said that when a man embarks on the paths of sorcery, he becomes aware, in a gradual manner, that ordinary life has been forever left behind, that knowledge is indeed a frightening affair, that the means of the ordinary world are no longer a buffer for him, and that he must adopt a new way of life if he is going to survive. The first thing he ought to do, at that point, is to want to become a warrior, a very important step and decision. The frightening nature of knowledge leaves one no alternative but to become a warrior. By the time knowledge becomes a frightening affair, the man also realizes that death is the irreplaceable partner that sits next to him on the mat. Every bit of knowledge that becomes power has death as its central force. Death lends the ultimate touch, and whatever is touched by death indeed becomes power. A man who follows the paths of sorcery is confronted with imminent annihilation every turn of the way, and unavoidably he becomes keenly aware of his death. Without the awareness of death, he would be only an ordinary man involved in ordinary acts. He would lack the necessary potency, the necessary concentration that transforms one's ordinary time on earth into magical power. Thus, to be a warrior, a man has to be, first of all, and rightfully so, keenly aware of his own death. But to be concerned with death would force any one of us to focus on the self, and that would be debilitating. So the next thing one needs to be a warrior is detachment. The idea of imminent death, instead of becoming an obsession, becomes an indifference. Don Juan stopped talking and looked at me. He seemed to be waiting for a comment. "Do you understand?" he asked. I understood what he had said, but I personally could not see how anyone could arrive at a sense of detachment. I said that from the point of view of my own apprenticeship, I had already experienced the moment when knowledge became such a frightening affair. I could also truthfully say that I no longer found support in the ordinary premises of my daily life. And I wanted, or perhaps even more than wanted, I needed, to live like a warrior. "Now you must detach yourself," he said. "From what?" "Detach yourself from everything." "That's impossible. I don't want to be a hermit. To be a hermit is an indulgence, and I never meant that. A hermit is not detached, for he willfully abandons himself to being a hermit. Only the idea of death makes a man sufficiently detached, so he is incapable of abandoning himself to anything. Only the idea of death makes a man sufficiently detached, so he can't deny himself anything. A man of that sort, however, does not crave, for he has acquired a silent lust for life and for all things of life. He knows his death is stalking him and won't give him time to cling to anything, so he tries, without craving, all of everything. A detached man, who knows he has no possibility of fencing off his death, has only one thing to back himself with: the power of his decisions. He has to be, so to speak, the master of his choices. He must fully understand that his choice is his responsibility, and once he makes it, there is no longer time for regrets or recriminations. His decisions are final, simply because his death does not permit him time to cling to anything. And thus, with an awareness of his death, with his detachment, and with the power of his decisions, a warrior sets his life in a strategical manner. The knowledge of his death guides him and makes him detached and silently lusty. The power of his final decisions makes him able to choose without regrets, and what he chooses is always strategically the best, and so he performs everything he has to with gusto and lusty efficiency. When a man behaves in such a manner, one may rightfully say that he is a warrior and has acquired patience. Don Juan asked me if I had anything to say, and I remarked that the task he had described would take a lifetime. He said I protested too much in front of him, and that he knew I behaved, or at least tried to behave, in terms of a warrior in my day-to-day life. "You have pretty good claws," he said, laughing. "Show them to me from time to time. It's good practice." I made a gesture of claws and growled, and he laughed. Then he cleared his throat and went on talking. When a warrior has acquired patience, he is on his way to will. He knows how to wait. His death sits with him on his mat, they are friends. His death advises him, in mysterious ways, how to choose, how to live strategically. And the warrior waits. I would say that the warrior learns without any hurry because he knows he is waiting for his will, and one day he succeeds in performing something ordinarily quite impossible to accomplish. He may not even notice his extraordinary deed. But as he keeps on performing impossible acts, or as impossible things keep on happening to him, he becomes aware that a sort of power is emerging. A power that conies out of his body as he progresses on the path of knowledge. At first it is like an itching on the belly, or a warm spot that cannot be soothed. Then it becomes a pain, a great discomfort. Sometimes the pain and discomfort are so great that the warrior has convulsions for months. The more severe the convulsions, the better for him. A fine power is always heralded by great pain. When the convulsions cease, the warrior notices he has strange feelings about things. He notices that he can actually touch anything he wants with a feeling that comes out of his body from a spot right below or right above his navel. That feeling is the will, and when he is capable of grabbing with it, one can rightfully say that the warrior is a sorcerer, and that he has acquired will. Don Juan stopped talking and seemed to await my comments or questions. I had nothing to say. I was deeply concerned with the idea that a sorcerer had to experience pain and convulsions, but I felt embarrassed about asking him if I also had to go through that. Finally, after a long silence, I asked him, and he giggled as if he had been anticipating my question. He said that pain was not absolutely necessary. He, for example, had never had it, and Will had just happened to him. One day I was in the mountains, he said, and I stumbled upon a puma, a female one. She was big and hungry. I ran and she ran after me. I climbed a rock and she stood a few feet away ready to jump. I threw rocks at her. She growled and began to charge me. It was then that my will fully came out, and I stopped her with it before she jumped on me. I caressed her with my will. I actually rubbed her tits with it. She looked at me with sleepy eyes and lay down, and I ran like a son of a bitch before she got over it. Don Juan made a very comical gesture to portray a man running for dear life, holding onto his hat. I told him that I hated to think I had only female mountain lions or convulsions to look forward to if I wanted Will. My benefactor was a sorcerer of great powers, he went on. He was a warrior through and through. His will was indeed his most magnificent accomplishment. But a man can go still further than that. A man can learn to see. Upon learning to see, he no longer needs to live like a warrior, nor be a sorcerer. Upon learning to see, a man becomes everything by becoming nothing. He, so to speak, vanishes and yet he's there. I would say that this is the time when a man can be or can get anything he desires. But he desires nothing, and instead of playing with his fellow men like they were toys, he meets them in the midst of their folly. The only difference between them is that a man who sees controls his folly, while his fellow men can't. A man who sees has no longer an active interest in his fellow men. Seeing has already detached him from absolutely everything he knew before. The sole idea of being detached from everything I know gives me the chills, I said. You must be joking. The thing which should give you the chills is not to have anything to look forward to, but a lifetime of doing that which you have always done. Think of the man who plants corn year after year until he's too old and tired to get up, so he lies around like an old dog. His thoughts and feelings, the best of him, ramble aimlessly to the only things he has ever done, to plant corn. For me, that is the most frightening waste there is. We are men and our lot is to learn and to be hurled into inconceivable new worlds. Are there any new worlds for us really? I ask half in jest. We have exhausted nothing, you fool, he said imperatively. Seeing is for impeccable men. Temper your spirit now, become a warrior, learn to see, and then you'll know that there is no end to the new worlds for our vision. Don Juan did not make me leave after I had run his errands, as he had been doing lately. He said I could stay, and the next day, June 28, 1969, just before noon, he told me I was going to smoke again. Am I going to try to see the Guardian again? No, that's out. This is something else. Don Juan calmly filled his pipe with smoking mixture, lighted it, and handed it to me. I experienced no apprehension. A pleasant drowsiness enveloped me right away. When I had finished smoking the whole bowl of mixture, Don Juan put his pipe away and helped me stand up. We had been sitting facing each other on two straw mats he had placed in the center of his room. He said that we were going for a short walk and encouraged me to walk, shoving me gently. I took a step and my legs sagged. I did not feel any pain when my knees hit the ground. Don Juan held my arm and pushed me up on my feet again. You have to walk, he said, the same way you got up the other time. You must use your will. I seemed to be stuck to the ground. I attempted a step with my right foot and almost lost my balance. Don Juan held my right arm at the armpit and gently catapulted me forward, But my legs did not support me, and I would have collapsed on my face had Don Juan not caught my arm and buffered my fall. He held me by the right armpit and made me lean on him. I could not feel anything, but I was certain that my head was resting on his shoulder. I was seeing the room from a slanted perspective. He dragged me in that position around the porch. We circled it twice in a most painful fashion. Finally, I suppose, my weight became so great that he had to drop me on the ground. I knew he could not move me. In a certain way, it was as if part of myself deliberately wanted to become lead heavy. Don Juan did not make any effort to pick me up. He looked at me for an instant. I was lying on my back facing him. I tried to smile at him and he began to laugh. Then he bent over and slapped me on the belly. I had a most peculiar sensation. It was not painful or pleasurable or anything I could think of. It was rather a jolt. Don Juan immediately began to roll me around. I did not feel anything. I assumed he was rolling me around because my view of the porch changed in accordance with a circular motion. When Don Juan had me in the position he wanted, he stepped back. "Stand up," he ordered me imperatively. "Stand up the way you did it the other day. Don't piddle around. You know how to get up. Now get up." I intently tried to recollect the actions I had performed on that occasion, but I could not think clearly. It was as if my thoughts had a will of their own, no matter how hard I tried to control them. Finally, the thought occurred to me that if I sat up as I had done before, I would certainly get up. I said, "Up," loud and clear, but nothing happened. Don Juan looked at me with obvious displeasure and then walked around me toward the door. I was lying on my left side and had a full view of the area in front of his house. My back was to the door, so when he walked around me, I immediately assumed he had gone inside. "Don Juan," I called loudly, but he did not answer. I had an overpowering feeling of impotence and despair. I wanted to get up. I said, "Up," again and again, as if that were the magic word that would make me move. Nothing happened. I had an attack of frustration and I went through a sort of tantrum. I wanted to beat my head against the floor and weep. I spent excruciating moments in which I wanted to move or talk, and I could not do either. I was truly immobile, paralyzed. "Don Juan, help me," I finally managed to bellow. Don Juan came back and sat in front of me, laughing. He said that I was getting hysterical and that whatever I was experiencing was inconsequential. He lifted my head and, looking straight at me, said that I was having an attack of sham fear. He told me not to fret. "Your life is getting complicated," he said. "Get rid of whatever it is that's causing you to lose your temper. Stay here quietly and rearrange yourself." He placed my head on the ground. He stepped over me and all I could perceive was the shuffling of his sandals as he walked away. My first impulse was to fret again, but I could not gather the energy to work myself into it. Instead, I found myself slipping into a rare state of serenity. A great feeling of ease enveloped me. I knew what the complexity of my life was. It was my little boy. I wanted to be his father more than anything else on this earth. I liked the idea of molding his character and taking him hiking and teaching him how to live, and yet I abhorred the idea of coercing him into my way of life. But that was precisely what I would have to do, coerce him with force, or with that artful set of arguments and rewards we call understanding. I must let him go, I thought. I must not cling to him. I must set him free. My thoughts brought on a terrifying feeling of melancholy. I began to weep. My eyes filled with tears and my view of the porch blurred. Suddenly I had a great urge to get up and look for Don Juan to explain to him about my little boy, and the next thing I knew, I was looking at the porch from an upright position. I turned around to face the house and found Don Juan standing in front of me. Apparently he had been standing there behind me all the time. Although I could not feel my steps, I must have walked toward him, because I moved. Don Juan came to me smiling and held me up by the armpits. His face was very close to mine. Good work," he said reassuringly. At that instant I became aware that something extraordinary was taking place right there. I had the feeling at first that I was only recollecting an event that had taken place years before. At one time in the past I had seen Don Juan's face at very close range. I had smoked his mixture, and I had had the feeling then that Don Juan's face was submerged in a tank of water. It was enormous and it was luminous and it moved. The image had been so brief that I did not have time to really take stock of it. This time, however, Don Juan was holding me, and his face was no more than a foot away from mine, and I had time to examine it. When I stood up and turned around I definitely saw Don Juan. The Don Juan I know definitely walked toward me and held me. But when I focused my eyes on his face, I did not see Don Juan as I am accustomed to seeing him. Instead, I saw a large object in front of my eyes. I knew it was Don Juan's face, yet that knowledge was not guided by my perception. It was, rather, a logical conclusion on my part. After all, my memory confirmed that the instant before, the Don Juan I know was holding me by the armpits. Therefore the strange, luminous object in front of me had to be Don Juan's face. There was a familiarity to it, yet it had no resemblance to what I would call Don Juan's real face. What I was looking at was a round object which had a luminosity of its own. Every part in it moved. I perceived a contained, undulatory, rhythmical flow. It was as if the flowing was enclosed within itself, never moving beyond its limits, and yet the object in front of my eyes was oozing with movement at any place on its surface. The thought that occurred to me was that it oozed life. In fact, it was so alive that I became engrossed looking at its movement. It was a mesmerizing fluttering. It became more and more engrossing, until I could no longer tell what the phenomenon in front of my eyes was. I experienced a sudden jolt. The luminous object became blurry, as if something were shaking it, and then it lost its glow and became solid and fleshy. I was then looking at Don Juan's familiar dark face. He was smiling placidly. The view of his real face lasted an instant, and then the face again acquired a glow, a shine, an iridescence. It was not light as I am accustomed to perceiving light, or even a glow, rather it was movement, an incredibly fast flickering of something. The glowing object began to bobble up and down again, and that disrupted its undulatory continuity. Its shine diminished as it shook, until it again became the solid face of Don Juan, as I see him in everyday life. At that moment I vaguely realized that Don Juan was shaking me. He was also speaking to me. I did not understand what he was saying, but as he kept on shaking me I finally heard him. "Don't stare at me. Don't stare at me," he kept saying. "Break your gaze. Break your gaze. Move your eyes away." Shaking my body seemed to force me to dislodge my steady gaze, Apparently, when I did not peer intently into Don Juan's face, I did not see the luminous object. When I moved my eyes away from his face and looked at it with the corner of my eye, so to speak, I could perceive his solidity, that is to say, I could perceive a three-dimensional person. Without really looking at him, I could, in fact, perceive his whole body, but when I focused my gaze, the face became at once the luminous object. "Don't look at me at all," Don Juan said gravely. I moved my eyes away and looked at the ground. "Don't fix your gaze on anything," Don Juan said imperatively, and stepped aside in order to help me walk. I did not feel my steps and could not figure out how I performed the act of walking, yet with Don Juan holding me by the armpit, we moved all the way to the back of his house. We stopped by the irrigation ditch. "Now gaze at the water," Don Juan ordered me. I looked at the water, but I could not gaze at it. Somehow the movement of the current distracted me. Don Juan kept on urging me in a joking manner to exercise my gazing powers, but I could not concentrate. I gazed at Don Juan's face once again, but the glow did not become apparent anymore. I began to experience a strange itching on my body, the sensation of a limb that has fallen asleep. The muscles of my legs began to twitch. Don Juan shoved me into the water and I tumbled down all the way to the bottom. He had apparently held my right hand as he pushed me, and when I hit the shallow bottom, he pulled me up again. It took a long time for me to regain control over myself. When we got back to his house hours later, I asked him to explain my experience. As I put on my dry clothes, I excitedly described what I had perceived, but he discarded my entire account, saying that there was nothing of importance in it. "Big deal," he said, mocking me. "You saw a glow, big deal." I insisted on an explanation and he got up and said he had to leave. It was almost 5 in the afternoon. The next day I insisted again on discussing my peculiar experience. "Was it seeing, Don Juan?" I asked. He remained quiet, smiling mysteriously, as I kept pressing him to answer me. "Let's say that seeing is somewhat like that," he finally said. "You were gazing at my face and saw it shining, but it was still my face. It just happens that the little smoke makes one gaze like that. Nothing to it." "But in what way would seeing be different? When you see, there are no longer familiar features in the world. Everything is new. Everything has never happened before. The world is incredible." "Why do you say incredible, Don Juan? What makes it incredible?" "Nothing is any longer familiar. Everything you gaze at becomes nothing. Yesterday you didn't see. You gazed at my face and, since you like me, you noticed my glow. I was not monstrous, like the Guardian, but beautiful and interesting. But you did not see me. I didn't become nothing in front of you. And yet you did well. You took the first real step towards seeing. The only drawback was that you focused on me, and in that case I'm no better than the Guardian for you. You succumbed in both instances and didn't see. Do things disappear? How do they become nothing? Things don't disappear. They don't vanish, if that's what you mean. They simply become nothing, and yet they are still there. How can that be possible, Don Juan? You have the damnedest insistence on talking," Don Juan exclaimed with a serious face. "I think we didn't hit it right about your promise. Perhaps what you really promised was to never, ever stop talking." Don Juan's tone was severe. The look in his face was concerned. I wanted to laugh, but I did not dare. I believed that Don Juan was serious, but he was not. He began to laugh. I told him that if I did not talk I got very nervous. "Let's walk, then," he said. He took me to the mouth of a canyon at the bottom of the hills. It was about an hour's walk. We rested for a short while, and then he guided me through the thick desert underbrush to a water hole, that is, to a spot he said was a water hole. It was as dry as any other spot in the surrounding area. "Sit in the middle of the water hole," he ordered me. I obeyed and sat down. "Are you going to sit here too?" I asked. I saw him fixing a place to sit some 20 yards from the center of the water hole, against the rocks on the side of the mountain. He said he was going to watch me from there. I was sitting with my knees against my chest. He corrected my position and told me to sit with my left leg tucked under my seat and my right one bent, with the knee in an upward position. My right arm had to be by my side with my fist resting on the ground, while my left arm was crossed over my chest. He told me to face him and stay there, relaxed but not abandoned. He then took a sort of whitish cord from his pouch. It looked like a big loop. He looped it around his neck and stretched it with his left hand until it was taut. He plucked the tight string with his right hand. It made a dull, vibratory sound. He relaxed his grip and looked at me and told me that I had to yell a specific word if I began to feel that something was coming at me when he plucked the string. I asked what was supposed to come at me, and he told me to shut up. He signaled me with his hand that he was going to commence. He said that if something came at me in a very menacing way, I had to adopt a fighting form that he had taught me years before, which consisted of dancing, beating the ground with the tip of the left foot, while I slapped my right thigh vigorously. The fighting form was part of a defense technique used in cases of extreme distress and danger. I had a moment of genuine apprehension. I wanted to inquire about the reason for our being there, but he did not give me time and began plucking the string. He did it various times at regular intervals of perhaps 20 seconds. I noticed that as he kept plucking the string, he augmented the tension. I could clearly see that his arms and neck were shivering under the stress. The sound became more clear, and I realized then that he added a peculiar yell every time he plucked the string. The combined sound of the tense string and the human voice produced a weird, unearthly reverberation. I did not feel anything coming at me, but the sight of Don Juan's exertion and the eerie sound he was producing had me almost in a state of trance. Don Juan relaxed his grip and looked at me. While he played, his back was turned to me and he was facing the southeast, as I was. When he relaxed, he faced me. "Don't look at me when I play," he said. "Don't close your eyes, though. Not for anything. Look at the ground in front of you and listen." He tensed the string again and began playing. I looked at the ground and concentrated on the sound he was making. I had never heard the sound before in my life. I became very frightened. The eerie reverberation filled the narrow canyon and began to echo. In fact, the sound Don Juan was making was coming back to me as an echo from all around the canyon walls. Don Juan must have also noticed that and increased the tension of his string. Although Don Juan had changed the pitch, the echo seemed to subside, and then it seemed to concentrate on one point, toward the southeast. Don Juan reduced the tension of the string by degrees until I heard a final dull twang. He put the string inside his pouch and walked toward me. He helped me stand up. I noticed then that the muscles of my arms and legs were stiff, like rocks. I was literally soaked in perspiration. I had no idea I had been perspiring so heavily. Drops of sweat ran into my eyes and made them burn. Don Juan practically dragged me out of the place. I tried to say something, but he put his hand over my mouth. Instead of leaving the canyon the way we had come in, Don Juan made a detour. We climbed the side of the mountain and ended up in some hills very far from the mouth of the canyon. We walked in dead silence to his house. It was already dark by the time we got there. I tried to talk again, but Don Juan put his hand on my mouth once more. We did not eat and did not light the kerosene lantern. Don Juan put my mat in his room and pointed at it with his chin. I understood it as a gesture that I should lie down and go to sleep. "I have the proper thing for you to do," Don Juan said to me as soon as I woke up the next morning. "You will start it today. There isn't much time, you know." After a very long, uneasy pause, I felt compelled to ask him, "What did you have me doing in the canyon yesterday?" Don Juan giggled like a child. "I just tapped the spirit of that water hole," he said. "That type of spirit should be tapped when the water hole is dry, when the spirit is retreated into the mountains. Yesterday I, let us say, woke him up from his slumber. But he didn't mind it and pointed to your lucky direction." His voice came from that direction. Don Juan pointed toward the southeast. "What was the string you played, Don Juan?" "A spirit catcher." "Can I look at it?" "No. But I'll make you one. Or better yet, you will make one for yourself someday, when you learn to see. What is it made of, Don Juan?" "Mine is a wild boar. When you get one you will realize that it is alive and can teach you the different sounds it likes. With practice you will get to know your spirit catcher so well that together you will make sounds full of power." "Why did you take me to look for the spirit of the water hole, Don Juan?" "You will know that very soon." Around 11:30 a.m. we sat under his ramada, where he prepared his pipe for me to smoke. He told me to stand up when my body was quite numb. I did that with great ease. He helped me walk around. I was surprised at my control. I actually walked twice around the ramada by myself. Don Juan stayed by my side, but did not guide me or support me. Then he took me by the arm and walked me to the irrigation ditch. He made me sit on the edge of the bank and ordered me imperatively to gaze at the water and think of nothing else. I tried to focus my gaze on the water, but its movement distracted me. My mind and my eyes began to wander onto other features of the immediate surroundings. Don Juan bobbed my head up and down and ordered me again to gaze only at the water and not think at all. He said it was difficult to stare at the moving water and that one had to keep on trying. I tried 3 times and every time I became distracted by something else. Don Juan very patiently shook my head every time. Finally I noticed that my mind and my eyes were focusing on the water, in spite of its movement. I was becoming immersed in my view of its liquidness. The water became slightly different. It seemed to be heavier and uniformly grayish-green. I could notice the ripples it made as it moved. The ripples were extremely sharp. And then, suddenly, I had the sensation that I was not looking at a mass of moving water, but at a picture of water. What I had in front of my eyes was a frozen segment of the running water. The ripples were immobile. I could look at every one of them. Then they began to acquire a green phosphorescence, and a sort of green fog oozed out of them. The fog expanded in ripples, and as it moved, its greenness became more brilliant until it was a dazzling radiance that covered everything. I don't know how long I stayed by the irrigation ditch. Don Juan did not interrupt me. I was immersed in the green glow of the fog. I could sense it all around me. It soothed me. I had no thoughts, no feelings. All I had was a quiet awareness, the awareness of a brilliant, soothing greenness. Being extremely cold and damp was the next thing I became aware of. Gradually I realized that I was submerged in the irrigation ditch. At one moment the water slipped inside my nose, and I swallowed it, and it made me cough. I had an annoying itch inside my nose, and I sneezed repeatedly. I stood up and had such a forceful and loud sneeze that I also farted. Don Juan clapped his hands and laughed. "If a body farts, it's alive," he said. He signaled me to follow him and we walked to his house. I thought of keeping quiet. In a way, I expected to be in a detached and morose mood, but I really did not feel tired or melancholy. I felt rather buoyant and changed my clothes very rapidly. I began to whistle. Don Juan looked at me curiously and pretended to be surprised. He opened his mouth and his eyes. His gesture was very funny, and I laughed quite a bit longer than it called for. "You're cracking up," he said, and laughed very hard himself. I explained to him that I did not want to fall into the habit of feeling morose after using his smoking mixture. I told him that after he had taken me out of the irrigation ditch, during my attempts to meet the guardian, I had become convinced that I could see if I stared at things around me long enough. "Seeing is not a matter of looking and keeping quiet," he said. "Seeing is a technique one has to learn. Or maybe it is a technique some of us already know." He peered at me as if to insinuate that I was one of those who already knew the technique. "Are you strong enough to walk?" he asked. I said I felt fine, which I did. I was not hungry, although I had not eaten all day. Don Juan put some bread and some pieces of dry meat in a knapsack, handed it to me, and gestured with his head for me to follow. "Where are we going?" I asked. He pointed toward the hills with a slight movement of his head. We headed for the same canyon where the water hole was, but we did not enter it. Don Juan climbed onto the rocks to our right, at the very mouth of the canyon. We went up the hill. The sun was almost on the horizon. It was a mild day, but I felt hot and suffocated. I could hardly breathe. Don Juan was quite a way ahead of me and had to stop to let me catch up with him. He said I was in terrible physical condition and that it was perhaps not wise to go any further. He let me rest for about an hour. He selected a slick, almost round boulder and told me to lie there. He arranged my body on the rock. He told me to stretch my arms and legs and let them hang loose. My back was slightly arched and my neck relaxed, so that my head also hung loose. He made me stay in that position for perhaps 15 minutes. Then he told me to uncover my abdominal region. He carefully selected some branches and leaves and heaped them over my naked belly. I felt an instantaneous warmth all over my body. Don Juan then took me by the feet and turned me until my head was toward the southeast. "Now let us call that spirit of the water hole," he said. I tried to turn my head to look at him. He held me vigorously by the hair and said that I was in a very vulnerable position and in a terribly weak physical state, and had to remain quiet and motionless. He had put all those special branches on my belly to protect me and was going to remain next to me in case I could not take care of myself. He was standing next to the top of my head, and if I rolled my eyes I could see him. He took his string and tensed it, and then realized I was looking at him by rolling my eyes way into my forehead. He gave me a snappy tap on the head with his knuckles and ordered me to look at the sky, not to close my eyes, and to concentrate on the sound. He added, as if on second thought, that I should not hesitate to yell the word he had taught me if I felt something was coming at me. Don Juan and his spirit catcher began with a low-tension twang. He slowly increased the tension, and I began to hear a sort of reverberation first, and then a definite echo which came consistently from a southeasterly direction. The tension increased. Don Juan and his spirit catcher were perfectly matched. The string produced a low-range note and Don Juan magnified it, increasing its intensity until it was a penetrating cry, a howling call. The apex was an eerie shriek, inconceivable from the point of view of my own experience. The sound reverberated in the mountains and echoed back to us. I fancied it was coming directly toward me. I felt it had something to do with the temperature of my body. Before Don Juan started his calls I had been very warm and comfortable, but during the highest point of his calls I became chilled, my teeth chattered uncontrollably, and I truly had the sensation that something was coming at me. At one point I noticed that the sky had become very dark. I had not been aware of the sky although I was looking at it. I had a moment of intense panic, and I yelled the word Don Juan had taught me. Don Juan immediately began to decrease the tension of his eerie calls, but that did not bring me any relief. "Cover your ears," Don Juan mumbled imperatively. I covered them with my hands. After some minutes Don Juan stopped altogether and came around to my side. After he had taken the branches and leaves off my belly, he helped me up and carefully put them on the rock where I had been lying. He made a fire with them, and while it burned he rubbed my stomach with other leaves from his pouch. He put his hand on my mouth when I was about to tell him that I had a terrible headache. We stayed there until all the leaves had burned. It was fairly dark by then. We walked down the hill and I got sick to my stomach. While we were walking along the irrigation ditch, Don Juan said that I had done enough and I should not stay around. I asked him to explain what the spirit of the water hole was, but he gestured me to be quiet. He said that we would talk about it some other time. Then he deliberately changed the subject and gave me a long explanation about seeing. I said it was regrettable that I could not write in the darkness. He seemed very pleased and said that most of the time I did not pay attention to what he had to say because I was so determined to write everything down. He spoke about seeing as a process independent of the allies and the techniques of sorcery. A sorcerer was a person who could command an ally and could thus manipulate an ally's power to his advantage, but the fact that he commanded an ally did not mean that he could see. I reminded him that he had told me before that it was impossible to see unless one had an ally. Don Juan very calmly replied that he had come to the conclusion it was possible to see and yet not command an ally. He felt there was no reason why not, since seeing had nothing to do with the manipulatory techniques of sorcery, which served only to act upon our fellow men. The techniques of seeing, on the other hand, had no effect on men. My thoughts were very clear. I experienced no fatigue or drowsiness and no longer had an uncomfortable feeling in my stomach as I walked with Don Juan. I was terribly hungry, and when we got to his house I gorged myself with food. Afterwards I asked him to tell me more about the techniques of seeing. He smiled broadly at me and said that I was again myself. "How is it," I said, "that the techniques of seeing have no effect on our fellow men?" "I've told you already," he said. "Seeing is not sorcery. Yet one may easily confuse them, because a man who sees can learn, in no time at all, to manipulate an ally and may become a sorcerer. On the other hand, a man may learn certain techniques in order to command an ally and thus become a sorcerer, and yet he may never learn to see. Besides, seeing is contrary to sorcery. Seeing makes one realize the unimportance of it all." "The unimportance of what, Don Juan?" "The unimportance of everything." We did not say anything else. I felt very relaxed and did not want to speak anymore. I was lying on my back on a straw mat. I had made a pillow with my windbreaker. I felt comfortable and happy and wrote my notes for hours in the light of the kerosene lantern. Suddenly Don Juan spoke again. "Today you did very well," he said. "You did very well at the water. The spirit of the water hole likes you and helped you all the way." I realized then that I had forgotten to recount my experience to him. I began to describe the way I had perceived the water. He did not let me continue. He said that he knew I had perceived a green fog. I felt compelled to ask, "How did you know that, Don Juan?" "I saw you." "What did I do?" "Nothing, you sat there and gazed into the water, and finally you perceived the green mist." "Was it seeing?" "No. But it was very close." "You're getting close." I got very excited. I wanted to know more about it. He laughed and made fun of my eagerness. He said that anyone could perceive the green fog because it was like the guardian, something that was unavoidably there, so there was no great accomplishment in perceiving it. "When I said you did well, I meant that you did not fret," he said, "as you did with the guardian. If you had become restless I would have had to shake your head and bring you back. Whenever a man goes into the green fog his benefactor has to stay by him in case it begins to trap him. You can jump out of the guardian's reach by yourself, but you can't escape the clutches of the green fog by yourself. At least not at the beginning. Later on you may learn a way to do it. Now we're trying to find out something else." "What are we trying to find out?" "Whether you can see the water." "How will I know that I have seen it, or that I am seeing it?" "You will know. You get confused only when you talk." And that's not all. Our experts and regular viewers respond to all comments. Also check if you forgot to subscribe and set your bell to receive notifications about new audiobooks and other useful self-development materials that we release regularly. Join in the discussions, don't forget to give likes and, if possible and inspired, support the development of the channel financially. All useful links will be in the description and the first attached comment. Goodness, love and wisdom to all. And now move on to watch the next part of the video at the links below, or choose something from the playlists of the channel and those you see on the screen.